Hello, church family. I greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I miss you. I miss visiting your churches, sitting and chatting with you before and after worship, and so much more. But this will have to do for now. I'm here with you today because we are in a once in 100 years crisis. But I'd like to remind you that however tough these times might feel, I also know these are the times where we, the church, must rise and answer God's call for the moment we are living. Now, we know that as Baptists, I cannot speak for our churches in the way that an Episcopal priest could. But I can encourage and plead to you to speak out for justice. I can remind you of our call from Micah. What does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That flows very easily, but it is so very difficult to live out. Now, we have not always been on the right side. But we Baptists do have a long history of doing our best to follow Micah 6:8 into the world. And it seems to me that we have been closest when we have been grounded on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. In these historic times, I'd like to remind you how we have lived previous monumental moments in history. We as a church belong to a family of churches that, against the law, were active stops in the Underground Railroad. They were hiding runaway slaves in sanctuaries, in homes. Blessed are the merciful indeed. We belong to a family of churches who split with beloved family because they knew slavery is wrong. Blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. We belong to a family of churches who marched, were beaten, arrested, abused for months while waging peaceful struggle for basic civil rights like voting. We belong to a group of churches who have always known justice too often needs to be wrenched from the powerful. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So we belong to a family of churches who have always struggled for justice. Now, in that struggle, every time we have supported justice, there have been some who have accused us of bringing politics into the church. It's a common way to try to avoid the struggle for justice, but we have never allowed that to stop us in our struggle. Closer to home, as EBA, you belong to a family who has loved and supported Americans interned in concentration camps because of their Japanese heritage. You belong to a family who led the struggle against redlining, so all could live where they wished to live, not just where others told them to live. Blessed are the merciful indeed. You belong to a family who have led the struggle for justice for LGBTQA plus family. Closer to me, as EBA, you belong to only the second region in our entire American Baptist Church's history to call a Latino as their executive minister. What a heritage we share. Blessed are the pure in heart indeed. And it is in that spirit that I come to you in this crisis moment to ask you to struggle and hunger and thirst for righteousness while being disruptive peacemakers. As Baptists, we have been neck deep in every struggle for justice since we organized in these lands in the 1600s, before we even were a country. But sadly, the call to stand for justice has come to our doorsteps again. So I ask you, what does the Lord require of you? To do justice. Mr. Floyd was murdered by something worse than senseless violence. He was murdered for being insignificant. He, and therefore his life, simply did not matter to the officer choking him with his knee, even though there were already two other officers on top of his handcuffed body. That officer knew he was being filmed. He heard Mr. Floyd's cry out for air. He heard the bystanders letting him know what was clearly evident, that he was murdering somebody, and he simply did not care. This was not a split-second life or death situation. This was an intentional dismissal of human life. What does the Lord require of you? Also to love mercy. I'm not asking you to change your mind about looting and rioting being wrong, but I am asking you to be as angry about Mr. Floyd's death as others seem to be about looting and rioting. After all, Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us that there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. So do not fear what is happening. Do not be afraid of the protesting. It is nonviolent tension necessary for growth. Now, I am dressed this way because when a person of color in our country speaks truth to power, we often need to have a recognizable uniform to be less suspicious, maybe even trusted. But for our African American family in this country, too many times even that isn't enough. I ask you to stand for justice because that is unchristian. More clearly, it is literally against God's creation to mistrust someone just because of their appearance. Now, our country has exploded in protests significantly because of Mr. Floyd's murder, but mainly because his is the most recent in a long line. Mr. Arbery, Mr. Gardner, Mr. Crawford III, Mr. Brown Jr., Miss Tanisha Anderson, Miss Breonna Taylor, Emmett, and so many more. These protests are revealing generational trauma. The unleashing of pain that has catapulted hundreds of thousands to the streets is the result of trauma that, far from being addressed by the powerful, it's made worse by every unjustified act of violence and the near certain acquittal that follows. For example, even with clear evidence, it took 4 full days of large protests for this officer to be arrested, and even now he's not charged with first-degree murder. If this officer thought Mr. Floyd was lying when he was saying, "I can't breathe," he would have stopped when Mr. Floyd lost consciousness. What need is there to restrain someone who is unconscious? But he did not take his knee off of Mr. Floyd's neck until paramedics arrived. He meant to do that. So I come to you because the call to stand for justice has come to our doorsteps again. But how could we answer that call while walking humbly with our God? Well, speak out in every forum in which you have influence. Do the tedious work of keeping those in leadership accountable. Vote for justice every chance you get. Sure, at the ballot, but on the street, at the store, while waiting in line, when someone in front of you gets ID'd, when someone in front of you gets ID'd because of the color of their skin. Keep your church, your city, and police accountable to justice for all. Serve the outcast. Help people recognize that Black Lives Matter does not mean other lives don't. It is a shout to the world that Black lives must be as important, they must matter at least as much as other lives do. Reach out to those suffering in your contexts. Get to know them. Remain long after the protests are done. Show up every single time wretched racism rises. With firm love, stop your family, your friends, and anyone in your circle of influence when, in the safety of privacy, they show their casual racism. Walk into the discomfort of exploring the racism we have all been raised and lives within. This work is so very difficult because racism has so permeated our culture that doing away with it feels like our world is being taken from us. They're winning. Please answer the call for justice, because saying I'm not racist is no longer enough. Let us heed the call to do justice that has come to our doorsteps once again. For what does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. So show up, and when you do, stand firm, especially for those who are dispossessed. Do all of that while loving deeply, and repeat as necessary. Blessings to you in these difficult times.